Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, Food Safety Risks Associated with Adulterated and Misbranded Gluten-Free Products. Before we begin our presentation today, I would like to take a few moments to go over some housekeeping items. We will be recording this webinar, and this webinar is CLE approved, and we will be asking you to enter a passcode for CLE credit a few times throughout the presentation. In today's webinar, Dr. Suderman will discuss the available gluten-free grain ingredients, FDA food plan manufacturing requirements, food safety and audit requirements, package and labeling requirements, as well as state-of-the-art food safety forensics. To give you a little background about our presenter, Darrel Suderman, he is the president of Food Technical Consulting. He has worked for food manufacturing and leading restaurant chains for more than 20 years. For the last 7 years, Dr. Suderman has served as an expert witness and consultant for both plaintiff and defense attorneys throughout the United States. Dr. Suderman received his BS and MS degrees in agricultural education and his PhD in food science from Kansas State University. He holds 2 U.S. patents, has co-authored a food processing book, and has written over 40 peer-reviewed and trade magazine articles and white papers. He has worked in research and development, quality assurance, and food safety for many of the leading restaurant chains. In addition, Dr. Suderman co-founded Business IQ, LLC as a business intelligence IT consulting company, which has been accepted as an official partner of SAP Software Company. A few of his clients have included Foster Farms, Jenny O Turkey Store, Golden Plum Poultry, Johnsonville Sausage, E&J Gallo Winery, Tyson Foods, Organic Valley, and Jividan Roar Flavors. For those of our attendees who require a code word for tracking purposes, the code word for today is gluten. During the presentation, we will take short breaks, and during that time, we ask that you enter this code into the chat feature for CLE recording purposes. The chat feature is located to the right of your screen. Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must log onto your computer as yourself. If you have attempted to log on and received an error, or if you are listening via telephone, please email the passcode both times that it's requested, and please state the time that you have entered your code in your email. Also, please remember to complete the survey that will appear on your screen at the end of the presentation. As a provider of CLE credits, we are required to have supportive information that you have attended, and in many states the survey is required. Dr. Suderman welcomes your questions. Please use the chat feature to submit your questions throughout the presentation. We will take intermittent breaks so that Dr. Suderman can respond. Thank you all again for attending today, and Darrel, the presentation is now turned over to you.
Thank you very much. I look forward to talking to you today regarding food safety risks, primarily adulterated and misbranded gluten-free products. As you know or have heard, gluten-free food products are the rage of retail grocery markets right now and becoming trendy in the food service restaurant market. Gluten-free categories include bakery and confectionery, snacks, breakfast cereals, baking mixes and flours, and meat and poultry products. And they can be found in organic, natural, and conventional sales channels. I'm going to go over these areas today. Just in general, we'll start out with an introduction. We'll talk about what are glutens. We'll talk about gluten products, what I consider to be some litigation opportunities, the food safety forensic methodology that Emily just mentioned, and some concluding remarks. Not to repeat myself, but here's a little bit of my background again. As she mentioned, I received my PhD at Kansas State University. I've also taught as an adjunct professor at Johnson & Wales Culinary University in food product development here in Denver, Colorado. I've worked in the restaurant business for about 20 years in all different phases, including food safety, quality assurance, R&D, and I have 5 years of legal expert witness food litigation experience. I work as a gluten-free consultant, currently working with a company that's developed some pizza crust that they're trying to get into the restaurant market right now. And from an IT consulting standpoint, and this is colors some of my presentation today, is I've spent about 10 years as food, beverage, and supply chain management information technology consultant, which helps me understand the supply chain from the beginning and how product is made. This slide shows some of the papers and webinars that I've provided for TASA before. First one in 2010 was a white paper called Protecting Food and Beverage Recipe and Process Ownership. A year later, in 2011, I presented a webinar on emerging issues in food products litigation. And then a year later, in 2012, a webinar on top 5 consumer liability risks the public ignores. And then in 2011, I wrote an article for Trial Lawyer magazine called Public Safety Liability for Mobile Food Retailers and Quick Serve Restaurants. First area we'll talk about is what are glutens. This slide shows the molecular configuration of gluten and the 2 components that comprise gluten. Those 2 components are called gliadin and glutenin. The differences between these 2 molecules is not necessarily important other than a basic understanding of what gluten is and its primary role as a nutritional ingredient and trapping gases that gives rise to bread products. In the summer of 2014, a couple months ago, General Mills unveiled 150 new products that they are planning to bring to market and commercialize. And gluten-free products are the most visible category of the 150 new products generated by General Mills. This demonstrates that gluten-free product growth is continuing unabated. In fact, General Mills just announced this week that they are acquiring another company, organic company, called Annie's Homegrown Products, and I'm sure there's some gluten-free products in that. So what are glutens? Gluten is known as a protein in wheat and related plants, such as barley and rye. There are 2 main groups of proteins that comprise gluten, as we mentioned before, both gliadin, and they are short molecular chains, and the glutenins, which are large molecular chains. Gluten gives elasticity to dough, helping it to rise and keep its shape. Gluten is like most allergens in that they are proteins. What is celiac disease? Celiac disease is an autoimmune disorder that can occur in genetically predisposed people where the ingestion of gluten leads to damage of the small intestine. When people with celiac disease eat gluten, their body mounts an immune response that attacks the small intestine. These attacks lead to damage of the villi, small finger-like projections that line the small intestine that promote nutritional absorption. When the villi get damaged, nutrients cannot be absorbed properly into the body. Celiac disease is hereditary, meaning that it runs in families. People with a first-degree relative with celiac disease, whether it be a parent, child, or sibling, have a 1 in 10 risk of developing celiac disease. What are some of the long-term health effects? Celiac disease can develop at any age after people start eating foods or medicines that contain gluten. Left untreated, celiac disease can lead to additional serious health problems. Some of these health problems include the development of other autoimmune disorders like type 1 diabetes and multiple sclerosis, dermatitis, herpetoformis, which is an itchy skin rash, anemia, osteoporosis, infertility and miscarriage, neurological conditions like epilepsy and migraines, short stature, and intestinal cancers. So what is the treatment? Currently, the only treatment for celiac disease is lifelong adherence to a strict gluten-free diet. People living in gluten-free must avoid foods with wheat, rye, or barley, such as bread and beer. Holding back on beer might be tough for some, and ingesting small amounts of gluten, like crumbs from a cutting board or toaster, can trigger small intestinal damage. Celiac disease is also known as celiac disease, celiac sprue, non-tropical sprue, and gluten-sensitive enteropathy. All basically, they're different terms for the same thing. Other treatment that we mentioned as an environmental stress, it can also activate celiac disease. In people with celiac disease, gluten exposure evokes an immune-mediated response throughout the body and measurable damage to the intestinal lining. Some of the most common symptoms, as you will expect, are joint pain, anemia, diarrhea, constipation, fatigue, and irritability. And probably most of these all relate to just the body inability to absorb enough of each of the ingredients that it needs to sustain itself. What are some secondary gluten health risks? Well, iron deficiency anemia is one. Another is the early onset of osteoporosis or osteopenia, infertility and miscarriage, lactose intolerance, vitamin and mineral deficiencies, central and peripheral nervous system disorders. Others include pancreatic insufficiency, intestinal lymphomas and other GI cancers, gallbladder malfunction, neurological manifestations including ataxia, epileptic seizures, dementia, migraine, neuropathy, myopathy, and multifocal leukocytosis. What are some myths about gluten-free? And there are a few. The first is it's a weight loss guarantee, yet 32% of the doctors still recommend it. It does not work as a weight loss guarantee. Second myth is your taste buds will suffer, yet people rate gluten-free products and gluten-free products equal in taste, or gluten products equal in taste. Myth 3 is less gluten means a less upset stomach, but only if you have the celiac disease. Myth 4, you'll improve your diet, but the opposite may occur if nutrients aren't supplemented. And myth 5, gluten-free products are healthier than their counterparts if this hasn't been approved. The source for this information was Prevention Magazine this August, and the author was Zara Barnes, so you may want to look into that. We'll talk now a little bit about gluten products and some of the ingredients. Gluten-free ingredients include rice, corn, oats, gums, and other milk, soy, and egg proteins, which means that if you look at gluten-free products on the ingredient statement on boxes that you buy in the local grocery store or health food store, these ingredients are going to be in the ingredient statement more commonly than they're not, because these are the substitute ingredients that they create. In other words, they'll use these ingredients to make a gluten-free bread. Ingredients with gluten seem to be restricted to wheat, rye, and barley, but unsure about some of the other grasses which the wheat plant comes from and what they call ancient grains, because you're starting to see a lot of ancient grain products in the grocery stores also. I put this chart in by markets and markets analysis, and what it shows is the projected annual growth rate of gluten-free products. And as it states, the gluten-free product market is projected to grow at an annual growth rate of 10.2% from 2014 to 2019, in other words, in the next 5 years, and that North America is estimated to be both the largest market and the fastest growing market, followed by Europe and the rest of the world. So gluten-free product growth is going to continue at a very vigorous and rapid rate, which means there's going to be a lot more opportunities for litigating, partly because mistakes are made and smaller companies are getting into it and they don't put the prevention practices in place. So what are some of the more popular gluten-free products that you can find or buy in the store? Well, probably the most common would be the bread products, then cornbread, pancakes, batters and breadings for fried products, hamburger and hot dog buns, Danish, sweet rolls, brownie mixes, and pizza crust. And I have a picture here of a pizza product from Udi's. I don't know how familiar you are with the gluten-free market, but there's two principal companies that make products to compete with each other. They're both located in the Denver, Boulder, Colorado area where I live. And this is one of the companies. The other is Rudy's. And Rudy's recently was purchased by a company called Boulder Brands. And so you'll see that in the marketplace too, that branded product. So that not only do they have the Rudy's, but they have quite a few other organic products also. Some additional products also would be French baguettes, muffins, cookies, tortillas, bagels, frozen meals, chips, granola bars, and here's a picture of Udi's product that has the ancient grain in it. Now we'll take a pause for some additional questions that you might have.
Okay, and before we begin the question and answer segment, I asked all the attendees to type in the passcode that was given at the beginning of the presentation. Okay, our first question is, what is your opinion of the quality of gluten-free products?
The quality of gluten-free products is increasing year over year, without a doubt. I've been consulting with a company, as I mentioned before, that is marketing these products to major restaurant chains, and I've been surprised with the overall food quality. The quality of these products will attract people that don't even need gluten-free products and just want to improve overall category sales.
Okay, our next question is, what are the risks with organic gluten-free products?
The risk, as I see them, is that organic-free products carry the product risk that they will usually buy ingredients from small suppliers and until organic product acreages increase. Usually what happens is with small suppliers, they don't have their quality system set up the way they should. They don't have the money available to do the level of testing they probably should. That's my concern with gluten-free products. It's also kind of my concern when it comes to grown locally products that they're marketed in the grocery stores.
Okay, and you had mentioned ancient grains earlier on. Could you just kind of go into what those exactly are?
I don't have the specific species in front of me, but the wheat plant, where we get most of our gluten from, is considered to be quote-unquote a grass. And some of these ancient grain products, which are grown kind of in the northern part of the United States, they are variations of that. And there is only one major company that I know that is processing those, and it happens to be Ardent Mills, which used to be a division of ConAgra, and over the past few weeks has been transitioning away from ConAgra as their own independent company based here in Denver, Colorado.
Okay, those are all the questions we have for now, so please continue on with the presentation.
Okay. I want to talk about some litigation opportunities now and kind of help you become familiar with what some of the FDA and USDA labeling laws are. The first is what is the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act of 2004. Well, this act is an amendment to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and it requires that the label of a food that contains an ingredient that is or contains protein from a major food allergen must declare the presence of that allergen in the manner described by the law. So, first point, you're on first base, and what we're saying is you've got to be able to declare what's in that food product, as many of you well know. What I think personally are the two principal litigation opportunities are both adulteration and misbranding. Adulteration, if any substance has been mixed or packed with it so as to reduce or lower the injuriously affect its quality or strength. And if any substance has been substituted wholly or part of the article, that would be considered adulteration. Misbranding really gets into the labeling area. If it is to be labeled and branded as, if it's mislabeled or misbranded, it becomes misleading and deceptive to the consumer. What are some of the FDA labeling requirements? Well, right now, the use of an ingredient that results in the presence, and this happens to be gluten, 20 parts per million or more gluten in the food, or more gluten inherently does not contain gluten, that any avoidable presence of gluten in the food is below 20 parts per million. A food that bears the claim no gluten, free of gluten, or without gluten in its labeling and fails to meet the requirements of a gluten-free claim will be deemed to be misbranded. I've kind of added a footnote here in that Udi's branded products owned by, or Rudy's I think is owned by Boulder Brands, has set a 10 parts per million label above and beyond what the federal limit is. And I'm hearing of more and more food companies that sell gluten-free products to using this 10 parts per million, and part of that comes from marketing pressure against competing products. In addition, a food whose labeling includes the term wheat in the ingredient list or in a separate contains wheat statement as required by a section of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and also bears the claim gluten-free, will be deemed to be misbranded unless its labeling also bears additional language clarifying that the wheat has been processed to allow the food to meet FDA requirements for a gluten-free claim. This slide shows you examples of gluten-free labels. There is, to the best of my knowledge, there is no one label that the government requires. So it's kind of open in the marketplace right now as to how companies can declare gluten-free products. You'll see a couple insignias to the left, and then you'll see Udi's gluten-free foods, that's what they call it. Bisquick, which used to be owned by General Mills, but they just put gluten-free on. And then you'll see in the upper right-hand corner where one company is not only saying it's wheat-free or it's gluten-free, but it's also wheat-free. And it's also dairy-free. So you're going to see a lot of different types of labels, and there's no set standard right now, as opposed to organic, where you have kind of one label, organic certified, and you go from there. What are some gluten-free certification organizations? What is the mission of Gluten-Free Certification Organization? This is the name of an organization, GFCO. It was established in 2005. The Gluten-Free Certification Organization is dedicated to providing affordable certification services to producers of gluten-free products using quality assessment and control measures throughout the production in order to provide assurance to the consumers of the safety of their foods. So what is the value of the added effect of GF gluten-free labeling? Well, this certification organization provides a certification seal that is easily identified and provides consumer assurance that the product meets strict standards for gluten-free. Now keep in mind, this is an independent organization. It's not a government organization. So there's no legal weight, in my opinion, to back up whatever they may state. But it's important that you are aware that this organization out there, and they're a major player. And to show you just how big a player they are, how many companies I've listed here utilize the gluten-free logo in North America? Well, this organization currently certifies 21,000 products sold in 5 countries, and it's expanding. Audits are conducted in 25 countries around the world. The best advice I could give people is it's probably the best certification organization going forward, but it's not a requirement that you use them. I want to talk a little bit about some of the FDA and USDA manufacturing requirements. These are really the 2 organizations that we need to be concerned with here in the United States. The first point is that the food product should not inherently contain gluten, and that any unavoidable presence of gluten in the food is below 20 parts per million. This minimum criteria has been established by the FDA, and the inherent implication that each gluten-free product is monitored by a HACCP plan. Now, a HACCP plan means Hazard Analysis Critical Control Plan. It is something that the government requires for every food product, every food plan in the United States. And it's set up to be preventative in nature and to prevent people from getting contaminated food into their bodies. In order for products to qualify under the Celiac Support Organization, and this appears to be, based on my research, the leading celiac disease organization, companies must be able to validate that their processing procedures have removed the offending amino acid sequences from wheat, barley, rye, or common oats used in their product, which adversely impacts those with celiac disease. The verification must show the final product is less than 5 parts per million of quantifiable gluten. Some of the minimum manufacturing GMP or good manufacturing practice requirements include the inherent implication that each gluten-free product is monitored by any one or more of the following plans. A HACCP plan, which I just talked about. Another is an Allergen Management System certification based on allergy, hot, and asthma, and standard developed by Service Allergy Swiss. This is organizations in Europe that we probably don't encounter very much here in the United States, but it's worth knowing about. Then in Canada, they have their own gluten-free certification program. So I heard of an instance where someone was making a product in another country, and that country checks to make sure that the food products leaving that country or entering the country are indeed gluten-free, and they do their own testing. So it needs to start with a good program here in the United States first if we're going to export. Some additional manufacturing GMP requirements is that administration of all aspects of gluten-free certification plan has been assigned to the Allergen Control Group. The GFCP can be integrated with GFSI, which means the Global Food Safety Initiative, or other food safety certification schemas. Adherence to good manufacturing practices and food allergens need to be tested at every stage of the manufacturing process. So it doesn't mean that just when you're planning on sheeting the dough out and cutting the pizza dough circles that you test in, but you test the mixer where the flour and the water and everything go in, and you test products after they're made too, and even after they're baked. Here's some manufacturing litigation risks that I can envision. First is in the area of product development. And the cause of a risk here would be the misidentification of allergen ingredients, sub-ingredients, or carrier materials. Another litigation risk area would be the receiving of raw ingredients, in that during the receiving area or time, they would be mishandled, misstored, and not well documented for traceback, so that a QA auditor can go back and track back to where the original product was shipped from. And then the equipment is another litigation area, is that it leaves a trace allergens due to poor cleanup. And I foresee this to be a big, big deal. And then processing would create risk because it would not have inadequate, or it would have inadequate control measures. Packaging the label is another area where there was maybe inadequate redundancy checks. In other words, instead of just one person signing off on ingredient or gluten-free product or an ingredient that goes into a food product, they would have another person back that up with their own inspection eyes. And then the finish of product testing, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but there is not just one, but two, and only two methods that can be used to determine whether gluten is in a food product. I put this slide in because of my experience in the restaurant business, but also because I believe that the litigation risk is greater in the restaurant business than it is in the food manufacturing area, just because of the nature of how the operations are executed. And the first litigation risk in the restaurant would be the cross-contamination. And a very simple explanation of that might be, or an example of that might be, in a pizza restaurant, they may sprinkle wheat flour onto the working table where they flatten the pizza crust out to keep it from sticking to the table when they put the toppings on it. Well, there might be a guy working right next door to them, or right next to him, a couple feet away, on an organic pizza product, and he inadvertently puts his hands into the same wheat flour to sprinkle onto the table with a pea crust instead of maybe using a cornstarch flour, and there's just a lot of cross-contamination opportunities. The second item that I have listed here is that restaurants may not even have a HACCP plan. I've worked for about 12 major restaurants, and not everyone has a HACCP plan for their restaurant, even despite the fact that they're pretty large size. Now, you get to small startup restaurants, and the likelihood of them having a HACCP plan is probably close to nil, and so that's why I listed this. Another risk would be that they don't use an outside certified auditor company, or they don't execute allergen testing, or they don't use ingredients, they don't have a segmented ingredient storage space for gluten-free products. And kind of give you another counterweight to that is, I've worked in a lot of restaurant chains that served chicken, and the chicken comes in raw. And one of the first things I would, as vice president of the company, go into the coolers and make sure that the raw chicken is on the bottom shelves of the walk-in cooler and not in the top, so that it can't be dripping down into produce and other ingredients. Another area of risk might be that there's no segmentation of smallwares in the back of the restaurant. Smallwares means forks, spoons, measuring devices, cups, and that kind of thing. Or they don't do any allergen swab testing to see if the protein is still in the presence, or if it even got transferred through the air currents in the store. And there just isn't proof of a clean environment in some of these restaurants. This slide talks a little bit about the U.S. restaurant alternate naming, and this is interesting. Restaurants could be worst-case scenario, again, because, let me give you some examples. Texas Roadhouse markets its product as gluten-friendly. That certainly doesn't say gluten-free. And Olive Garden makes, quote-unquote, no guarantees regarding the gluten content of these items. They're trying to put a disclaimer out and really don't take any responsibilities for ensuring that the customers who eat their store truly are getting a gluten-free product. Real restaurant menu advisory states that any of the 8 allergens could be present. I think that's kind of like the ultimate disclaimer. It's like, we serve 8 products here, but there's no guarantee that they're gluten-free. Well, why would you buy them if you were a celiac disease-prone person? And then the risk of eating an allergen in a restaurant is much greater than a manufactured complete product, as I mentioned before. What are some adulteration and incident risk management best practices? And the key words here are incident risk management. So when you do find that gluten product is in a gluten-free, and that creates an incident, then what do you need to have in place to manage against that incident? Because every food manufacturing plant needs a risk management process. And once a security breach is reported, that would include the following. They need to have a pre-established incident management plan and a corrective action plan. So, well, now that we found the problem, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to correct it? How are we going to pull product off the store shelves, out of our inventory? The CEO needs to be the lead spokesman. There needs to be a recall plan, a previous mock recall experience. In other words, what this means is a practice session that they recalled a product. It could be they recalled a product from a grocery store shelf like Kroger. Or it could be we recalled a product out of California Pizza Kitchen, as an example. And then there needs to be a product disposal plan, because sometimes these get into the supply chain and they're in warehouses across the United States, and even having that product present, even though it may be packaged, might be viewed by some distribution companies, such as Marriott, as to be a risk to their other products. So it can get very complicated. Here I've listed the definition of an incident. As I mentioned before, it's an event that could lead to loss of or disruption to an organization's operations, services, or other functions. If not properly managed, an incident can escalate into an emergency, crisis, or disaster. Incident management is therefore the process of limiting the potential disruption caused by such an event, followed by a return to business as usual. And this topic here, incident definition, actually represents another webinar that I presented for TASA some time before. If you want to get more on it, you can look through their website to find it. In food safety management, first thing is risk management. In simple terms, this relates to practices designed to prevent a situation from occurring. Whereas we just talked about incident management being a situation has already occurred. There's another category that a food company could ascend to, and that's what they call a heightened incident, where a situation has escalated to near crisis. And then crisis management is at the point the damage has occurred and is continuing, and the response has to be swift to clean it up and in some cases limit it. So in different litigation cases you might be in, one of the things you want to determine pretty quickly when you're talking to a client is it a risk management situation, or is it an incident management, or is it a crisis management? You need to identify quickly what that is. Listed here are the 4-phase processes within incident management. One is prevention. You want to employ a good food safety culture and include staying current on risk factors. From a litigation standpoint, you might want to take a real close look at the food safety culture. And the culture is something you can almost get a feel for just walking into a food processing plant. By just listening to people talk, how did they respond to a situation? Are they urgent about it? And this is very, very valuable information for you to make note of. And then preparation, proactively planning for a problem and monitoring public discussion risk. Management, well, implementing the plan using multiple messages and media. And then recovery would be reassessing risk exposure and telling the story of change. Those are the four phases of incident management. Now, I mentioned before that there's 2 and only 2 analytical procedures for measuring whether gluten is present. And there's an important distinction because you can't always, one isn't always used when the other one's used or can be used as a substitute. The first, and probably the more common, is what they call ELISA. The ELISA methods detect the actual allergen protein molecule by binding antibodies to the allergen and then using an enzyme-like conjugate to create a colorimetric change that can be measured. Colorimetric is the key word there. There are certain instances, though, that ELISA methods should not be used. Some matrices can interfere with the ELISA method, such as chocolate, or can cause cross-reactivity as seen between different types of nuts. This method is also not the most suitable for cooked or heated products because the protein molecules are denatured or broken down and the allergen is no longer detectable, but may still cause problems to sensitive individuals. So just to give you a couple ideas here, first of all, you can't use this when you have a chocolate product or if the product is cooked or heated. In those situations, you need to use a PCR gluten test methodology. The more difficult name is polymerase chain reaction method, which are more sensitive and detect the DNA molecules of these allergens. They can be used in raw and cooked products and are not affected by the heating process because DNA typically remains intact after being exposed to the cooking temperatures of most foods. PCR methods are also not subject to the typical interferences that inhibit ELISA that we just mentioned. Another important point is that oils and other products such as milk or eggs cannot be tested by PCR because they do not contain DNA. So this is just a reference for you that will hopefully be helpful. Thank goodness we have at least two methods that do it. But just in summary, as I mentioned, there's two complementary tests. The PCR is used for raw and cooked products because they're unaffected by the heat process. PCR is the most sensitive to DNA molecules. It cannot be used when no DNA is detectable. But ELISA, on the other hand, detects actual allergen protein, but it doesn't work on heated and chocolate products. Some of the FDA packaging label requirements would be that you must declare all known allergens in the food product following the word contains. The country of origin labeling requirements apply, and a certificate of analysis documents required from domestic and foreign sourced ingredients. In other words, this is a piece of paper that travels with the product that you're shipping into your plant to make a gluten-free product. It could be whey or something like that. And it just is a guarantee that it doesn't have gluten in it. Now, the manufacturer would normally take and retest it himself just to make sure. I want to talk briefly about food safety forensics methodology that I've developed. This methodology is exciting for me because this summer here in Denver, the Association of Food and Drug Officials met. And one of their methodologies that the methodology they're promoting is what they call an integrated food safety system. It's exactly the kind of scope from beginning to end of the supply chain that my food safety forensic methodology fits. But the IFSS is something that the food and drug officials, that's their mantra right now, and that's what they're working for. So it's good for you to know that. As I mentioned before, food safety forensics methodology is a holistic supply chain approach. It maps the manufacturing process, equipment locations, ingredient locations, and environmental airflow in grid-like schemes. It utilizes backtracking of potential allergen and contamination point by bag, by lot, by truckload, by receiving date, by warehouse inventory location, and individual suppliers. In other words, it's just not satisfied that I found a gluten contamination. I want to know a lot more. I want to know what led to that. And that's the methodology. It utilizes forward mapping from incident infraction from individual product package, case, pallet to in-house inventory, outside distribution center, and to customer. Once the incident mapping has occurred, product swabbing for protein allergen is meticulously applied to verify and delink the mapping result. The goal is an allergen process tracking validation. Once the mapping and verification processes have been documented, then a disposal action plan is immediately implemented. Upon product removal, then the contaminated production area room is washed to remove the protein allergen. This is repeated time and time again until swab testing provides quote-unquote an all clear. We're kind of getting to the end here, and I just listed other food allergens that the European Union recognizes. Celery, gluten, eggs, fish, lupin, and quite a few others listed here. I won't go into them all. Some of the new frontiers, I really believe is going to start coming big and strong in the pet food area, both for cats and dogs. And I've listed a couple product recall examples, I think about 4 of them. The first one happened just this year, in 2014. Middle Eastern bakery in Lawrence, Massachusetts is recalling lots of market basket dairy-free, gluten-free pancakes. Product recall example number 2, again, 2014, very recent. Frito-Lay initiated a voluntary recall of oven-baked Lay's barbecue. Product was recalled because its packaging face is incorrectly labeled with the Frito-Lay gluten-free logo. And I used to work for PepsiCo, and I'm really kind of surprised that they let that mistake go through. Third recall example would be in 2012, Bumble Bars recalling certain lots of gluten-free cafe chocolate sesame bars because they had the potential to be contaminated with salmonella. So it wasn't so much just gluten-free, but it was microbial pathogen contamination. And then example 4, the Raymond Haley Corporation in Spencer, New York, included a lot of gluten-free branded chocolate cake mix and gluten-free white cake mix because they may contain undeclared allergen milk. If you want some websites to go to find out what the recall cases are, if you want to keep up with it, I've listed this in this slide for both the USDA and the FDA. So I think that's the last one. Thank you. And then we'll have questions.
Okay, could all the attendees type the passcode once again to the chat feature? And our first question is, isn't there some question about whether oat gluten can also trigger an autoimmune response?
There is. And I don't have all the information on it. It has been brought up. I'm aware of it. If that situation comes up, it's just going to require a little bit more current research to find out whether that's true or not.
Okay, and can you give an idea of how much 20 milligrams of gluten is, for example, in relation to the size of a breadcrumb?
I had it on one of the slides. I think it was 20 milligrams per kilogram or something like that. It's on one of the slides. I want to take time to go back on it now, but I have it listed on one of the slides.
Okay, we will be sending those slides out to everyone tomorrow, so they'll be able to see that. Our next question is, Canada is required to specify if wheat, barley, and rye are in ingredients labeled natural flavors or malt. In the U.S., it is not required. The identical product in Canada will say natural flavors wheat, and here will only say natural flavors. Has this changed with the new rules?
I don't think it has changed with the new rules. Sometimes you'll run into situations where other countries, and Canada is kind of known for this, to be a little bit more stringent than even what the United States is. And the same applies to the European Union. So you just have to kind of take it on a case-by-case basis. I've worked considerably in Canada, and I have nothing but the highest regard for their government inspection programs. They're very good.
Okay, and since barley and rye are not food allergens, are they not required to be tested along the manufacturing process?
No, they're not required along the manufacturing process, but it always if you're not sure of how the barley and rye flour were necessarily treated or processed, you may want to do your own testing just to be sure, because that's why they call accidents accidents. They were unexpected, and you just don't want to be surprised with an expensive recall.
Okay, and our next question is, again, barley and rye are not one of the 8 allergens, so what responsibility do restaurants have with labeling these ingredients?
They don't have any responsibility. Not for those two.
Okay. Our next question is, Brio referred to 8 allergens. Can you list the allergens, and are there more than 8?
There are 8, and I'm trying to look back. And they are wheat, eggs, fish, clam shell, what I call mollusk, nuts, seafood crustaceans. There should be close to 8. I listed the European one here, and I just read from that, but there's 8.
Okay, and what additional gluten-free product risks can you think of?
Well, first of all, whether it's in the product, finished product, or not, and secondly, if it is, you also need to know exactly where you're buying from, who you're buying from, and personally, I would even, and we did this a lot in the restaurant when I worked for Kentucky Fried Chicken or Wendy's or someone like that. We would ask them to provide proof, and we would also spell out the exact method of analysis. In other words, I talked about the ELISA and the RCA, and we would require our suppliers to do all that testing. So a lot of times, from a sourcing standpoint, restaurants are very good. But from a execution standpoint, in a restaurant building, I don't have that same confidence, speaking from experience.
Okay. Is it true that in the U.S. and Canada, that the ingredient identified as modified food starch is usually derived from corn and not wheat?
That is true. I've never heard it associated with wheat, that terminology. But modified food starch can be modified a lot of different ways, such as chemical treatment, heat treatment, physical treatment. There's different ways. Modified basically said it's not the natural form and it can be processed a multitude of ways.
Do you know if any cafeterias in federal buildings or school districts have restrictions regarding food allergens or gluten?
I'm not familiar with anything specifically, and I just finished a case in April and related to child nutrition program. But first of all, the product, if it's gluten-free, it has to be on the box that would go into, let's say, an elementary school refrigerator or dry storage area. Now, to the best of my knowledge, whether that school puts a sign out so that parents of students and students can see that this is gluten-free or this is not gluten-free, I'm not aware of any federal law that requires that right now. And I'd hope that they would do that, but I'm not aware of any law that actually requires basically what they would say is point-of-sale declaration.
Okay, what are some of the more common reasons for the FDA or USDA to issue a product recall?
Can you state that again, please?
What are some of the more common reasons for the FDA or USDA to issue a product recall?
Interestingly enough, one might think immediately that it was contaminated food, but when I kind of follow these things and track them on a daily basis, I see a lot of situations more often than not. It's just mislabeled or misbranded products having to do with the labeling. surprising, but that makes up, I think, more than 50% of the cases.
And you mentioned food safety forensics. What makes this methodology so unique for application to gluten-free products?
Well, like I said, it maps in the same direction and according to the same principles that the Association of Food and Drug Officials on the integrated system. It takes a holistic approach from the beginning of a product supply chain to the very end. In other words, it tracks and looks for inconsistencies or production problems or contamination points, all the while from a product is received on a dock of a food processing plant, goes into dry storage, and goes to the production floor. It's programmed into their software systems, and then gets through the production, and whether it goes into a freezer, into a distribution center, it's tracked that whole way. In other words, a lot of micro contamination cases really deal with where did it happen and what was the enumeration, or how many organisms or pathogens or how many numbers of a certain pathogen were found. And most people in legal situations, they don't go back and say, well, it's one thing to know what that pathogen was, it's one thing to know another way how many, but where did it all happen? And the reason I say that is because of the case that happened within the last couple of years here in Colorado with Jensen Melons. Is for the first time what made that case so unique is that the owners were prosecuted in a criminal way. And a lot of times, and I'm not an attorney, but in my expert witness work, a lot of times to prosecute someone successfully, you need to be able to show intent. And a lot of ways to document intent might be to show and document patterns. And where the system broke down multiple places before they even happened, as the pathogen was actually discovered. So it takes a front-to-back holistic approach to analyzing. It's not maybe fit for all cases, but for bigger cases, and particularly for criminal cases, it has to be done.
Okay, I think this will be our last question, but what represents the biggest risk of overlooking the obvious in a gluten-free litigation case?
I believe the biggest risk for adulteration and mislabeling cases is a tendency to be satisfied that a problem was identified and not to consider other human behavior that led to the contamination. Some things to consider would be a pattern of plant contamination in the same location. Another one would be the inadequate training, and that could be a very, very valid argument, I believe, in a jury trial. And then the pattern of inconsistent food safety programs or poorly written food safety programs. So we're talking about, well, you just didn't have a food safety program typed up or printed or in a file or something like that, but how thoroughly written was it? Because if there's gaps in it, then people weren't trained properly. And then if people aren't trained properly, they're not observing, they're not measuring their risk, and they're not attuned to finding out what some of the problems are. So that would be my answer to that question.
Okay, we actually have one more question. What might be the weakest links in the chain preventing gluten contamination?
I believe it comes down to the gluten-free ingredient suppliers' technical competence. For example, many suppliers have small annual sales figures, and I'm referring to gluten-free just because there isn't that much acreage planted for gluten-free products in the United States yet, even though it goes up every year. And some of these smaller companies just don't have the financial resources to train their people correctly. It's always better to use larger suppliers with highly trained technical and analytical staff, but if those aren't available, then you really need to double up and make sure that the small suppliers are giving you a truthful gluten-free product. That's all.
Okay. I think we're going to just continue on with the CLE information. This webinar is eligible for CLE credit in California, Illinois, Minnesota, Missouri, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Texas. To ensure that you receive your CLE credit, please complete the survey at the end of the presentation. In addition to being your best source for testifying and consulting experts, TASA also offers e-discovery and document management solutions, free interactive webinars, and research reports on expert witnesses such as the Challenge History Report 2.0, the Professional Sanction Search, and the Expert Profile 360. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and most especially Darrel Suderman for his time and effort in creating this presentation. If you would like to speak with Dr. Suderman, or if you would like to speak with a TASA representative regarding an expert witness for a case that you are working on, please contact TASA at 1-800-523-2319. This is a reminder that we will be sending out a link to you tomorrow with the archive recording. The archive recording will also be posted in the Knowledge Center on TASA's website. If you have any questions or comments, please email Carol Kovaleski. Thank you all again for attending today, and have a great day, everyone.